adjusted his reading glasses and glanced over at his wife, Linda, who was staring intently at her phone. Her lips were pressed together in that tight, thin line he knew all too well. "Your mom again?" he asked, setting down his newspaper. Linda sighed. "Yes. She thinks we don't visit enough, and when we do, she complains that I'm not doing things the way she likes. Last time she told me my meatloaf was too modern. What does that even mean?" Mark chuckled. "At least she still lets you cook. My dad won't even let me touch the grill when we visit." "That's because he still thinks you're the reckless 25-year-old who once caught a steak on fire," Linda teased, shaking her head. Mark and Linda had been married for nearly 30 years. They were in their early 50s now, empty nesters adjusting to a new phase of life. But while their children had grown and moved out, their relationships with their in-laws had only become more complicated. Linda's mother, Margaret, was 78, fiercely independent, but equally stubborn. She had been a homemaker her entire life and took pride in her traditional ways. Meanwhile, Mark's father, Richard, a retired construction foreman, still carried an air of authority in every interaction, and decades keeping the peace, biting her tongue, and trying to be the good daughter-in-law. But now she just wanted to live her life without a running commentary. One evening, after a particularly exhausting visit where Margaret had criticized everything from Linda's haircut to the way she stacked plates, Linda finally snapped. "Mom," she said, voice firm, "I love you, but I'm not 25 anymore. I'm not going to change who I am just to fit your idea of the perfect daughter-in-law. If you want me to visit more often, you have to accept me as I am." Margaret had been stunned into silence, a miracle in itself. A week later, Linda received a handwritten note in the mail. "Dear Linda, I suppose I've been a bit hard on you over the years. I just want things to be the way they were, but I realize that's not fair to you. I'll try to do better. Love, Mom." Linda had stared at the note for a long time, then placed it in a keepsake box. It wasn't a grand apology, but it was something. Mark had his own struggles with Richard. Every visit to his father's house felt like a test of masculinity. "Still working that desk job, huh?" Richard would say, shaking his head. "I don't know how you do it, sitting all day. A real man needs to use his hands." Mark had spent years trying to impress Richard, helping with home projects, fixing things, even learning how to grill the right way. But no matter what he did, Richard always found a way to make him feel like a clueless rookie. Then, last Thanksgiving, everything changed. Richard, stubborn as ever, had decided to climb onto the roof to fix a loose shingle. A totally normal activity for a 79-year-old man with bad knees, of course. Mark had watched in horror as his father-in-law wobbled, lost his balance, and nearly tumbled off. Without thinking, Mark sprinted forward and caught him just in time. As he helped Richard back down, he braced for a gruff dismissal. Instead, Richard muttered, "Guess I'm not as strong as I used to be." For the first time in their decades-long relationship, Mark saw something new in his father-in-law. Vulnerability. That night, as they sat by the fire, Richard handed Mark a beer and said, "You know, I've given you a hard time over the years, but you've always been there for Linda and the kids. That's what matters. You're a good man." Mark didn't need anything more. As Mark and Linda lay in bed that night, they reflected on how much things had changed. "Our parents are getting older," Linda mused. "They still want to be in control, but they're realizing they can't be. And honestly, I think we're realizing we don't need their approval anymore." Mark nodded. Yeah, we spent years trying to prove ourselves. But at this stage in life, I just want to enjoy the time we have left with them, even with all the quirks and criticisms. Linda turned to him with a smile. So, what do you think? Should we visit my mom this weekend? Mark groaned. Do I have to? She might have pie. Mark sighed. Fine, but if your dad asks me to fix something, I'm faking a back injury. Linda laughed. Deal. And with that, they turned off the lights, knowing that while family dynamics might never be perfect, Midlife had given them something invaluable: perspective. This story captures the essence of midlife relationships with in-laws, frustrating, funny, and unexpectedly touching. It's relatable for older audiences who have lived through these moments and can appreciate the humor and heart in navigating family ties. As Mark and Linda settled into midlife, one thing changed the dynamic with their in-laws: grandchildren. Margaret adored her grandkids, often treating them like royalty while still finding ways to critique Linda's parenting. You let them eat pizza for dinner. When you were little, I made everything from scratch. Are you sure they should be on those iPads so much? In my day, kids played outside. Linda, once eager to prove herself, now took a different approach. She let it roll off her back. Mom, in your day, kids also rode in cars without seatbelts. Times change. Meanwhile, Richard, who had once doubted Mark's capabilities, was now Mark's biggest ally when it came to being a grandparent. He took pride in teaching his grandsons how to fish, work with tools, and appreciate classic cars. One afternoon, Richard admitted, You know, Mark, you turned out all right. The kids look up to you. I guess I did okay with my daughter, too. It was the closest thing to an emotional speech Mark would ever get from his father-in-law, and he took it. As the years went on, the biggest shift came when Mark and Linda had to step into caregiving roles for their aging parents. Margaret, once fiercely independent, started forgetting things, like where she put her glasses or whether she had taken her medication. Linda found herself checking in more often, setting up doctor's appointments, and eventually having the difficult conversation about assisted living. For Mark, the moment came when Richard, the once unstoppable force of masculinity, couldn't fix the leaky sink anymore. Instead of asking Mark to step aside, he reluctantly handed him the wrench and said, You got this. Mark fixed the leak, and for the first time in years, Richard patted his shoulder. Didn't think I'd have to depend on my son-in-law one day, but here we are. It was a turning point, not just in their relationship, but in how they all saw each other. By their late 50s, Mark and Linda had learned one of the greatest lessons in dealing with in-laws: acceptance. Linda no longer tried to impress her mother. Mark no longer felt the need to win over his father-in-law. They had reached a stage where they simply enjoyed the moments they had left with them, good, bad, or ridiculous. One Thanksgiving, as the whole family sat together, Margaret leaned over to Linda and whispered, You know, your turkey is pretty good, almost as good as mine. Mark caught Richard sneaking an admiring glance as Mark effortlessly manned the grill, and in that moment, Mark and Linda realized something. The battle for approval had ended. They had outgrown the need to impress. Their parents had finally seen them for who they were, not just in-laws, but equals, and that was enough.